I'd like to welcome Chris MacQuarrie, who has graciously offered to give us a presentation today. Just a little background on Chris. He started working for us here at the Great Lakes Forestry Centre in 2010. Chris was also a visiting fellow at Northern Forestry Centre and a forest entomology technician at the Atlantic Forestry Centre. In addition to that, he also worked as a research assistant at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. Chris has done a variety of work on forest invasive and native insects here in Canada. He's been involved with work on native pests such as the spruce budworm, mountain pine beetle, and forest ant caterpillar. With invasive pests, he's worked with brown spruce longhorn beetle, hemlock woolly adelgid, and emerald ash borer. Some of his work has included tracking insect outbreaks, assessment of phytosanitary approaches to the treatment of wood, assessment tools for hemlock woolly adelgid, and examining the winter survival of EAB. He is also an editor for the Journal of the Entomological Society of Ontario, and he's active on social media such as Twitter. He's been active in promoting youth science through science fairs, student tours of the Great Lakes Forestry Centre, and other outreach programs. And today he'll be speaking to you on the emerald ash borer research and management in Canada, status and future directions. And I will turn that over now to Chris.
Thanks, Dan. Those were nice. That's quite the rundown. It basically sounds like I either can't keep a job or yeah. So this is really weird. I'm talking to a white wall in my basement in Sault Ste. Marie, but thank you all for taking the time to log in today. And this is just a little talk I'll give, and I think there'll be plenty of time at the end for questions. So this is, so in theory, I'm the one giving this talk, but this is with a lot of help from a lot of other folks that are active in emerald ash borer research in Canada. And so hopefully folks will recognize some names or some faces across the top and bottom there. These folks can see my mouse moving around the crew there standing in front of GLFC. That's my crew from last summer. That's Megan and Danny and Taylor, Ken and Jeff Fidgen, who will actually be shortly leaving us to go to the Atlantic Forestry Centre. So this is my chance to say sort of bon voyage to Jeff, and we've really enjoyed having him at AFC GLFC, and we look forward to him to his next stage at AFC. So that's really awesome. And then there's just a lot of other folks that were nice enough to give me slides for the talk for today. So thank you, everybody. I hope you're tuning in, and I hope I don't butcher what you've given me too badly. If I do, I'll make it up to you later. So I'm going to talk a little bit just about sort of a recap of emerald ash borer, and then I'll get into talking about sort of the research that's being done in CFS. So a little bit of introduction, spread in biology. So most folks will hopefully know the first detection of emerald ash borer was in Detroit, Michigan, and Windsor, Ontario in 2002. It had probably been in North America since the early to mid 90s, and that's based on some dendrochronology work that was done by the folks in southern Michigan there. So, the typical of invasive species, introduction, long lag period before it's finally detected, and then once we detect it, it's kind of off to the races. And so that's 2002. So if we skip forward 18 years, this is in yellow. So what you're seeing is a map of the Canadian Food Inspection Agency regulated area for emerald ash borer in Canada today. And so this isn't necessary. So this kind of reflects the invaded range of the insect in Canada. This is roughly where you would expect to find it. So we have sort of contiguous area in southern Ontario and parts of northern Ontario, southern Quebec, a corridor through New Brunswick, and then sort of little satellite regulated areas in Winnipeg, Thunder Bay, and then the Halifax area, Bedford, Halifax. So Stan, before we go on, I'll just check in to make sure everything sounds okay and looks okay.
Yeah, it sounds perfect.
Okay, great. Okay, so just for folks that aren't entomologists or don't know the biology of the bug, so the adult emerald ash borer emerges in the spring, sort of spring, early summer, so kind of like sort of now-ish, and flies around for a little bit, needs to feed on leaves of the ash tree to complete its maturation, and then when that's done, it mates. Female lays eggs underneath in bark crevices on the branches in the bole of the tree. These eggs hatch, the young neonate larvae sort of burrow into the bark, into the phloem tissue of the tree, where they feed for the rest of the summer and into the early fall. Has 4 stages, 4 larval instars, and then if it completes that feeding at the end of the growing season, it'll overwinter as a prepupa, and that's what this little sort of kind of J-looking thing is here in this picture, and it will form that little pupal chamber in the hardwood, and then in the spring, if it survives the winter, it emerges, it pupates and emerges as an adult. In southern Ontario and southern Quebec, most of the population takes about a year to go through this cycle. So you have adults, and then the next year you have adults again. As you move further north and as you're in younger infestations, a 2-year life cycle seems to be more common. So it takes 2 years for the insect to complete this life cycle. So it'll sort of hatch as an egg in the spring and then feed a little bit as a larva, and when winter comes, it just sort of hangs out in the bark, and then when it warms back up in the spring, starts feeding again, and then completes its development. But it needs that little bit of cold to trigger pupation, so it'll spend another winter as a prepupa and then emerge in the spring. So for the next little bit, I just wanted to give a sort of rundown of some of the influential work that's come out of the CFS on emerald ash borer, and so I thought I'd go back and figure out what the very first paper was with CFS authors on it, and actually it's this one. It's from 2006 in Chemical Ecology, and this is a collaboration between some folks from the University of Michigan, U.S. Forest Service, and then NRCan CFS Great Lakes Forestry Centre. The nice thing about this one is sort of highlights this sort of first paper was a collaboration with the folks in the States, and that's sort of something that we're still doing today with work on the biological control program and then breeding for ash resistance, and that's the sort of stuff I'll talk about later. And this one was sort of a first paper looked at the responses of the insects to different volatiles put off by Manchurian ash, which is the native host of emerald ash borer in Asia. And this was sort of worked with Gary Grant and Peter de Groot, who both unfortunately have passed away, and Linda McDonald, who has since retired, and Linda Buchan. So Linda was actually the only person I could reach out to find out about this paper, and so thanks to Linda for helping me out with this one. So this is kind of an interesting one. And so some other significant contributions that have come out of the CFS was this paper by Laura Timms, who is a graduate student at University of Toronto, and she she demonstrated where and when the insect attacks ash trees. So this is some of this information we need when we find a new insect to find out what the heck it's doing. Some other later work by Peter and Gary with some folks in the States looking at this role of the green leaf volatile compounds. So the stuff produced by smells produced by ash trees, which are important in how the insect actually finds the tree on the landscape. Some of the later work by Gary and Krista Rye with Barry Lyons and Mamdouh and Barry since retired. And this is the preferential attraction of male EAB to the Z3-hexanol over manuka oil, and this is sort of important later when we talk about the trapping work, and the Z3-hexanol is important in the lure we use in Canada over the manuka oil, which gets used in the States more. And then finally, this work by Peter Silk at AFC and Krista that showed the evidence for this contact sex pheromone, which is important in the mating process of emerald ash borer. And that's just sort of like a very quick highlight of what's been done, and these early papers and these other sort of works that have been published by the CFS on emerald ash borer. And as of earlier this week, it's about 73 journal articles and chapters and about 41 different technical notes. So a fair body of work put together over the last 18 years. And it set the stage for the development of some of the tools we use today to manage emerald ash borer in Canada. And I just wanted to review some of those. And so the first one, and the one folks I hope are most familiar with, would be triazin, and the work to determine to show that azadirachtin, which is the active ingredient, was effective was this work by Nicole McKenzie and Blair Helson, Dean Thompson, and other folks, and Joe Meading, now retired from Bioforest, and this was led to the development of triazin, which was commercialized by Bioforest, now Lalamond, and sold all over the world as triazin as a control tactic for emerald ash borer. We have this other work by Krista Ryle and Jeff Fidgen, Peter Silk, and Taylor Scarr, which showed the efficacy of the pheromones, so the 3Z-lactone pheromone and the host pheromone at detecting infestations of emerald ash borer. And this is the work that informs the trapping strategy used by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency for survey and detection of emerald ash borer across Canada. So this is informs what lure is used in the traps that they use to look for emerald ash borer. We also have some work on work by Krista Rowell and Jeff Vidgen and Jean Turgeon that developed and deployed the branch sampling method to detect and delineate new infestations, and this has been deployed across Canada and the US to guide response to new detections. So when you have a new infestation of emerald ash borer, this is the tool a lot of folks have used to figure out where in my city, where in my town are these infestations, and where do I have to prioritize my management efforts. And then finally, there's this more recent work by Robert Lavallee, George Kaipoku, and Barry, and looking at demonstrate the efficacy of a fungal treatment for controlling AAB, and this is now being tested by GDI in Quebec and the States under the name of the Fraxi Protect tool. And this is another tool for managing emerald ash borer infestations in cities. And this is evidence sort of that basic work that we've been doing, looks like 70 some odd publications and technical notes and whatever, of that basic work that we've been done on emerald ash borer over the last 15, 18 years, transitioning to the practical tools for managing the insect. And that's sort of what we're doing now. So what I wanted to, so the rest of the talk is a very rapid survey of what folks in the CFS are working on now to both improve the management of the insect. And what I've done is I took all the slides that folks were nice enough to send me, and I've gone ahead and broken them down into sections on survey and detection and management impact, then impacted risk and response. And so what I've done with these slides is I've given the names on them of the folks that provided them to me and sort of the PIs, and I encourage you to contact them if you have any questions. Certainly they're going to know a lot more about this stuff than I will. And I also apologize if I missed anybody. That was my oversight. And so a lot of the slides also have sort of background information that folks give me, and I might not cover all that. So Stan's recording this, and it'll be up on the FTP site, so you can always pause and read what's on the slides. But and I'm happy to answer questions when we get to the end. Survey detection in emerald ash borer is done primarily using these green prism traps I talked about earlier, using the 3Z hexanol and the 3Z lactone lure. And those are often used to detect establishing populations in places where we don't know where emerald ash borer is, and that's done across Canada. So Jeff Vidgen, when he was last summer at GLFC, has been looking at how frequently insects emerald ash borer caught on those traps are lost between the time the trap is put up in the tree and the time the trap is checked, because these traps are sticky. The insect, blunders along, lands on it, and then sometimes they can fall off. And so Jeff was curious, how often does that happen? And so what Jeff was able to show was that the loss of insects from these traps is associated with contact with the foliage. And so what that suggests is that these traps must be set up to minimize contact between, parts of the ash tree and the trap itself to reduce that false negative rate. So that false negative is, of course, catching an insect and that insect being lost before you check it. And so the next work that we maybe might get to this summer, next summer, is isolating and testing those loss rate factors that are removing emerald ash borer from traps. So John Sweeney and his colleagues out at AFC have been looking at alternatives to green traps. So if you look at this picture up here on the left, you see this sort of standard panel trap that most folks use, and then these green funnel traps, these Lingon funnel traps. Most folks might have seen these. They're black for surveying longhorn beetles and other kinds of beetles. These have been modified and are green for attracting EAB. And these green funnels are using in a variety of insect surveys. They don't suffer from the same kind of loss issues that Jeff was talking about, because instead of being stuck to the trap, they fall into this little cup at the bottom. Hopefully folks can see. And so John was looking at, what John has shown is that these funnel traps, if you put them really high up in the canopy, higher than we usually put the survey traps, the panel traps, they can catch significantly more EB than the panel traps when you place them at the standard deployment height. So if you want to increase that efficacy of EB detection, it's increased by putting these traps in the upper ash canopy. Armand Sagan and Daniel Doucette and Nathalie Isabelle and folks at LFC and GLFC have been examining using genomic tools to survey for emerald ash borer, and this is basically looking for genetic differences in patterns of gene expression between asymptomatic trees that are infested with emerald ash borer and uninfested trees. So what they looked at is changes in gene activation between infested and uninfested trees, and they found sort of a 2 to 7-fold changes in expression for these genes over here in this table on the left-hand side. And these all have sort of associated functions in their physiological pathways of the tree. And so the hypothesis is that North American ash can defend themselves against DEB, but that response is inadequate. And as an aside, that's consistent with field observations of emerald ash borer performance in green ash in places that the trees can defend themselves, but they're just not very good at it. But that genetic response can be detected. And one of the short-term applications of this work is to develop diagnostic kits that would allow you to survey for infestations in asymptomatic trees. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the longer-term applications for this genomic work when I get into the restoration section of the talk. So Veronique Martel and Christian Hébert at GLFC with some of their colleagues have been looking at a sort of more high-tech solution for detecting emerald ash borer in wood using CT scanners. And there are potential field applications here with new and more portable CT scanners that can actually be taken to the tree, and in phytosanitary applications, certifying ash and other species like birch for export as pest free if we're trying to send stuff overseas. And what Veronique and her group have shown is that the scanner can detect more insects than by peeling the branches, which is the way we do things when we're looking at the branch sampling approach. And it's perhaps a little bit more expensive, but it takes way less time. And if you've done any branch peeling, which we've done a fair bit at GLFC and in my lab, saving that time could be a big bonus if you're trying to delineate a new infestation. So there's some real interest here. Dennis Samsonov at GLFC and his colleagues in the US has been using optimization theory to identify the optimal allocation of different survey methods, and in this case, branch sampling and trapping. And what we know is that traps are less expensive to deploy as a survey technique, but they have a lower detection rate than the branch sampling method. So in theory, there's an optimal way to allocate traps versus branch samplings in, say, a city after new detection of emerald ash borer, just to best spend your money and time in trying to figure out where the bug is. And so what Dennis did is he used Winnipeg, they found emerald ash borer there in 2017 as sort of a model to test this. And so this is a map of sort of an outline map of Winnipeg showing the probability of invasion. These two little triangles are the sort of the two detections of EAB in Winnipeg. And so what Dennis did is looked at different ways of optimizing this problem of where to allocate your survey methods. First, by looking at effects like host density, because Winnipeg has a really good forest inventory for a survey, and looking at the host density and proximity to known detections, and then some later work incorporating routing of surveyors, like how they would actually move around within a city and how that would influence how you'd allocate your survey tactics. And what Dennis has shown, and Dennis and the colleagues have shown, is that around that initial detection, it actually makes more sense to use branch sampling. So that's sort of the green sort of squares here, and I apologize for folks who are colorblind. And with traps allocated to the periphery of the infestation. So basically says if right around, if you're trying to delineate around an infestation, is the branch sampling is probably the optimal method, and then use traps in other places where if you're not sure where the insect is. And the next step for this research is adapting it to larger scale and regional surveys outside of urban areas for emerald ash borer, and then for other species and other invasives that we're interested in. And finally, Kate Ryan has at Atlantic has been working with Maritime College of Forest Technology to survey Fredericton for EAB using the branch sampling technique. And these are some photos that Kate sent me of the survey they ran earlier this winter, I presume, when we were all still allowed to stand less than 2 meters close to each other. So this is the survey map for Fredericton and all the sites they surveyed, and these are the Ranger School, sorry, not Ranger School, Forest Technology School students who helped out with the survey. And as far as I know, they've yet to find this. They've been doing this for a couple of years, and they've yet to find an emerald ash borer in Fredericton, which is good news. So I'm going to change gears a little bit and talk a little bit about management of emerald ash borer in Canada, what we're doing and sort of the new stuff. So the big thing I'll talk about is the biological control program. Some folks maybe have heard of. I'll just give a quick summary of it. There's sort of longer versions of this presentation and more information if you're interested. So this has been running since 2013. It was started by Barry Lyons, who's since retired, and continued on by Krista Ryle, and Gene Jones is our lead technician who does basically all of the work, along with Tim Ladd and the folks in insect production and at GLFC. And we've released in Canada about a little over 200,000 of these 3 species of parasitoids that I'm showing on the screen here. These top 2 are the larval parasitoids, Tetrasticus and Spathius, and then we've got Ubius down here, which is the egg parasitoid. And this work's done in collaboration with the USDA, who provide us with the bulk of their insects that we use for releases in Canada, and we supplement these with colonies that we have at GLFC that provide about 2 sites per year of Tet and Ubius. Parasitoids have been released in North America since about 2010. We started doing releases in Canada in 2013. So what I'm showing now are maps of the release sites in Canada, and they're colored by year of releases. So sort of this kind of greeny color is 2013, up to brown is our releases that we made last year. By far the most releases we made have been of Tetrasticus plantapenisi. That's the workhorse of the biological control program in North America. That's by far the most released insect. We've also released Ubius agrilli in lots of places across Canada, and this is the egg parasitoid. And then last year, because of the rearing effort from the folks in the States, we were able to expand greatly the number of sites where we released Spathius gallinae. And Spathius is probably the most interesting one to me because it's well synced up with this with these 2-year life cycle and emerald ash borer. It seems to sort of line up, its phenology lines up better with theirs, and so this has some promise for these places where we might have more common 2-year life cycle. And we have 3 different research projects assessing the impact of the parasitoids. So there's the sort of standard impact assessment that's part of the USDA's release protocol, where we peel small trees looking for evidence of parasitoid establishment and feeding on the insect. And this is done a couple of years after the last release at each site. The second effort was a caging study that Megan Gray in my lab has led, looking at using exclusion cages to try to partition mortality between different parasitoids at the release sites to see if we're getting actually impacts on the population dynamics of the insect. And we started this last year. Started this 2 years ago. We would have probably finished it this year, but I think we're going to miss the window because of the good old COVID. And then finally last year we started the experiment looking at dispersal of parasitoids away from the release sites in Southern Ontario. They're sort of the longest established release sites, and we had a bunch of pan traps deployed around sites at different distances in Southern Ontario, and Megan is spending her lockdown time processing these samples in her front room and watching Netflix. So she's been processing all these samples, and hopefully we'll have some more to say sort of in the next year or 2. Keishan Sambaraju at LFC has also been looking at doing some complementary work on the release and recovery effort, using developmental and temperature modeling for the different parasitoid species to map the suitability of release sites in Canada. And this might help us in sort of selecting future release sites, places we want to let these parasitoids go. This is using the Climax tool. So going to stop for a second and stop talking about sort of the management of the insect and move on to risk and impacts. We're still trying to figure, what's the insect doing, where's it going, and what are the effects it's going to have in Canada and on our ecosystems. So some more Keishan's work has been developing predictive models for EAB, attempting to show where and when we might find new infestations of the insect, incorporating different physical and abiotic and biotic predictors, and using the detection occurrence points from the CFIA survey. And so this would be really helpful helping folks like CFIA and municipalities predict where to focus their survey efforts, looking at using different algorithms to do this. We've been working with a couple of academic partners to refine some of the developmental parameters for the insect. Ken Dearborn, the fellow there, is a PhD student at the University of Toronto, who's refining the development of rate models for EAB on different hosts. And this is work funded by both Surge and NRCan, and actually the government of the United Kingdom, to inform risk prediction for both North America and for Europe, because they're actually also concerned about incursions of the insect into Eastern Europe and then just into Western Europe and into the UK, because the risk that EAB poses to their ash trees. So Ken's working on this project. And then we've also been working with Megan Dool, who's a postdoctoral researcher at Western University in London, who's been examining cold tolerance in new infestations in Winnipeg. And what she's shown from some samples we got last year is that the Western population, that those Winnipeg insects are probably more cold tolerant than the Southern Ontario populations, and this is the sort of the blue versus the pink here, are more cold tolerant than the Southern Ontario populations that our current estimates of EB overwintering cold tolerance are based on, right? So this refines how well we think the insect will do as it moves further north and into Western Canada. We've also been doing some work with using EB as a model system to assess export risk of wood commodities exported from Canada that might be infested with wood borers. So we have lots and lots of infested ash trees that we can use as sort of samples to test different treatment approaches or production approaches on mitigating risk. And what we were able to show is that the standard treatments for ash lumber, basically what you do when you turn a log into a piece of lumber, remove most of the risk for ash wood being exported from Canada. And the one outcome of this was we had sort of continued access to the EU for the Canadian ash wood, which is a really kind of fun project to work on. So just shifting gears a little bit, talk a little bit about some of the work Isabel, Ben, and Krista have been done on ecological impact assessment of emerald ash borer. And this is some really long-term work that started back in 2010 in Ontario. And Isabel has examining the long-term impacts of EAB at 61 sites across southern Ontario since 2010 to assess the changes in the vegetation composition and the tree regeneration dynamics, as well as that progression of ash tree mortality. This is just a map of where some of these sites are. So this is sort of spanning the infestation timeline of emerald ash borer through southern Ontario. Started down here and it's slowly been moving up this way. And so what we know is, ash are a foundational species in many habitats across the range, and especially in riparian zones. And the loss of that could have these profound changes in forest community and impact ecological integrity across ash species geographic range, and particularly in these areas that are affected by anthropogenic disturbance and under pressure from exotic species, stuff like buckthorn and these other ones. And black ash is also really important, especially to Indigenous community, because of the use in traditional cultural activities. So this is a real issue especially in southern Canada. And in 2010, there's a sort of Isabel established this long-term monitoring program at the leading edge of the infestation in southern and eastern Ontario. And there's before that ash mortality really got going in these different landscapes to evaluate the impact of mortality following outbreak. So they established these 61 sites between 2010 and 2015, and then they've begun this summer, looking at re-inventorying those plots again, about 6 years after ash mortalities happened, to see what are the changes in dynamics in these stands. And this is work that's still ongoing. So lastly, I'm going to talk a little bit about restoration. So we've sort of run the gamut of how we're looking at impacts of emerald ash, we're managing it, and trying to figure out what the risk is. And now we're going to say, okay, what are we going to do after the emerald ash borer has run its course, and we want to try and are we able to put ash back on the landscape? And so some of this work is being led by Donnie McPhee at the National Tree Seed Centre in Fredericton, and he's been leading the collection of black ash seed and other plant material to serve as a resource for future restoration and tree beating programs. So they've been collecting. So last year they collected 383 collections last year, and from single trees, and they've also done twig or leaf samples. So have access to both the seed, but also this other plant material to serve as sort of rootstock for any kind of breeding program that might eventually go on. This is another map courtesy of Donnie, looking at the collection locations with the CFIA's detections of EAB overlapped on this map. So down here we have the oldest sites, and then up here we have sort of these newest detections out here to Bedford, and then Winnipeg and Thunder Bay. And the red indicates the areas where they want to make at least 15 single tree collections. So this sort of northern stretch of the northern extent of the range of ash in eastern Canada. And what they also sort of point out is there's very few surviving black ash smaller than 4 centimeters in these Lake Erie lowlands, and St. Lawrence lowlands are down here, and that's sort of those places where emerald ash borer has been the longest. And we know that EAB is really hard on black ash; it tends to kill it really quickly, and so this is a real sort of conservation, something that's really important for the conservation of the species. And so their high priority areas for collect are sort of around the Sioux and Thunder Bay, and then Winnipeg, and then out in the Maritimes in Nova Scotia for both black ash and then green and white ash to try and capture that material before those trees are gone. And then just jumping back to the earlier slide from Armand, he and Nathalie Isabelle and Danny Doucette and some other folks have been looking at genomic tools for informing breeding for ash that might, putting back ash back on the landscape that might be resistant to emerald ash borer. So if you can identify the specific components of the defensive response of the tree, you can use that to develop breeding tools to accelerate or identify and develop resistant ash to EAB. So knowing that, you can inform which trees we're going to pick to breed, so we can try and put resistant ash back on the landscape. And we know some trees are resistant, we know Manchurian ash, which is the native host, has resistance to emerald ash borer. There's some evidence that white ash, the evidence coming from the U.S., that white ash has some to resist EAB a little bit better. So there's the potential there to put ash back in the landscape that can better deal with EAB, and incorporating that into with things like the biological control program and other management tactics and risk assessment. There's potentially the ability to sort of have ash back on the landscape, incorporate it as a management tool so that we can actually retain that as part of the ecosystem in Canada. So that's like a super quick summary. I don't know about other folks, but it's a nice day here in Sault Ste. Marie, so you can get back outside, so I won't take up too much more of your time. Just some of the work that's going on in NRCan. I hope that was informative for some folks, and that I wanted to stress that I think there's lots of opportunities for work that needs to be done on emerald ash borer in Canada. I'm like, it's sort of the core of my research program, and I'm kind of a big fan of it, but I think there's a lot of other stuff that could be done, and if I've covered something here that's intrigued you, what I'd encourage you to do is get in touch with the PIs that I identified on the screen, and if you send me a message, and I'd be happy to connect you with them. I think there's lots of interesting stuff to do. To my colleagues, if they're listening, if I've butchered something that you sent me, I apologize, and I will make it up to you later. And so with that, I'll take any questions you might have, and I think for the folks on the line, if I can't answer a question, I don't do a very good job. I think if you type it in, Stan will read out your answer, or send me a nasty note on Twitter, and I'll respond. So. Okay, thanks everybody. Stan, I guess I'll switch it back over to you.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Excellent presentation as always. Okay, so for the folks out on the lines, unfortunately we can't unmute your phone or your lines, so there is a chat feature in the Teams event, and it should be up on your right side of your screen near the top. It's got a question mark and a couple of call outs. You can type in your question for Chris, and please send them in. I don't see any at the moment, but that doesn't mean, that either means Chris did an amazing job or you've left people speak.
They've all tuned out, Stan. They're all gone.
Well, it is getting nice out there. Last time
it is, yes.
25 degrees outside, so probably warmer now. So I strongly encourage people to put Chris to the test here and ask him questions. I do have one question though, Chris. Now, okay. You had mentioned Winnipeg. Are they doing testing or any work out west of Winnipeg looking for pockets of EAB, or is that, like, I'm trying to think, northern maybe out in Edmonton, or?
So CFI has its own survey that they run in different places across Canada. There's that they run across Canada for emerald ash borer, and they run traps in a couple different sites, like sort of major cities and in between. Some communities do run their own emerald ash borer survey on their own, and off the top of my head, I'm not sure. I can't remember who does their own survey, and that's that work that goes on. I know the sort of other. Yeah, that's just off the top of my head. If I think of one, I'll answer more. So, but yeah.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Heather McDonald has actually responded to you, Chris, and said we're still here, and she enjoyed it.
Thanks, Heather.
I don't know. This is pretty surprising. You probably are getting off lucky here because
I guess so.
Yeah, there's so far I've had no questions. Usually Sonia is good for it for her team. Maybe if Taylor's on the line, perhaps. Oh, Jason Leach just chimed in. Nice presentation, Chris. A lot to take in.
Thanks, Jason.
Dan McKinney, great job again. Thanks, Chris. A tip of the hat to you for helping us with the cost-benefit analysis on deregulation. Oh, what?
Oh, I published it,
You're
Stan.
publishing as I'm reading them.
Sorry, Stan. I had to push it. Yeah.
We should do a talk on that. The report will be published by PFC, Pacific Forestry Centre, for those who don't know, and we're writing a journal article. Emily Hope is leading.
Oh, good. So what Dan is mentioning is that the CFIA is considering deregulating emerald ash borer, which should change how they survey for it. And Dan's team, along with some folks at PFC, were tasked with doing a cost-benefit analysis of this, and they asked me questions about EAB biology that I did my best to answer. So I'm glad to hear that Emily's writing that out. I'm looking forward to seeing it. So.
Okay, so they're coming in fairly good now. Jason Leach has got a question for you. One question for you. What do you speculate the emerald ash borer situation will be in 20 years? It's just a speculation.
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's one of those. So in 20 years, we sort of know if we look at southern Michigan, we know we have an idea of what it might look like. I mean, ash is. The big ash has disappeared from the landscape, but there are still sort of these remnants around that are still on the landscape, and you can still occasionally find big trees, especially big white ash. So they might still be there. What we don't know is what the impact of the biological control agents will be. We've had them on the landscape sort of 8-10 years ish. We know from some of those early releases in Michigan that they are having an effect on the population. They're affecting the population dynamics. So if you say, and then there's this new work being done on breeding for looking at resistant ash and potentially reintroducing those in the landscape. So if you took those three things together in 20 years, you could potentially have ash back on the landscape and at some level being managed by a combination of biological control agents and reduced abundance as we get out of the outbreak peak, and then the parasitoids. So in theory, you could have ash on the landscape. It might not be as abundant as it was, right? I would be really surprised if we had sort of ash like as crazy abundant as it say was in Southern Ontario pre-EAB, but it could still be around, and that's what I'd hope would happen. So yeah.
Okay, so the next three are compliments. So Armand again said, "Great job, Chris."
Oh, good, you got in, Armand! Hooray!
Jeff Fidgen said the same, and Phil Weeb actually has joined in. And nice job, Chris. Nice to hear some familiar voices.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Armand.
And so far, you know what? That's pretty well it. I haven't seen any comments. Oh,
that was me.
That was you. Okay.
Yeah.
I was like, oh. So yeah. So I don't know. I guess there's no other questions.
That's cool. Really, we'll let folks go have lunch. That's okay. I'll go log into my email. Maybe they're all there.
Perhaps. You never know. Well, I will give it one more minute, and then what we'll do is we'll call it a day and let people go out and enjoy that sunshine.
What's the next seminar, Stan?
It is actually, you're going to put me on the spot because, of course, I'm not prepared. But just give me 2 seconds, please. Oh, Keishan has actually asked you a question.
Okay.
Okay.
I'll publish it. I can read it. Yeah.
Okay.
So Keyshawn's asked, what are my thoughts around COVID-19 on EAB spread and hotter than usual summer? Oh, that's a good question. I don't know what COVID would do. I mean, we assume that a lot of the spread is driven by people moving infested firewood around. So in theory, if people aren't moving around as much this summer, that the opportunity for establishment, opportunity for stuff getting moved around might be less this summer, I guess. The thing is, I'm not sure when we'd pick that up, because we have we know there's that lag between when stuff gets introduced and when we find it. Like Winnipeg's a perfect example. It was probably 5 or 6 years. So we'd be saying if they didn't get moved around this summer, we'd expect like a weird sort of no detections in 2025, 2026 maybe. Yeah, I don't know. And then the hotter than usual summer, that I think probably has a better chance to kick things over in that 1 year life cycle. And we know that the populations grow faster when they're in that 1 year life cycle. So there's the opportunity to kill more trees and certainly kill them quicker. So.
Okay, Danny Galarno has actually chimed in here. Excellent presentation, Chris. You did a nice job to provide an overview of all the works that is currently happening with Emerald Ash Borer, and looking forward to hear and discuss what other innovative ideas we should consider and potentially explore in the future. Enjoy this weekend, everyone. And Sonia, good talk.
Thanks, Danny.
Sonia mentioned, good talk. Sorry for this impertinent question, but isn't EAB somewhat of a lost cause?
Yeah, I get that question a lot. I used to have a manager that he still asks me that question. I guess is it a lost cause? I guess it comes back to what do we want to have ash on the landscape? We know that it has important ecological function. We know it has important cultural function. We know it has important, especially important in cities, right? I mean, it's in a lot of places in Canada. It's one of the few street trees that we can actually have that actually survives in our urban environment and does reasonably well when it's not being hammered by EAB. And so we've sort of taken a decision. Yeah, we would like to have that on the landscape. And so then the question is, how do we manage it, right? And so we look at the tools that we want to manage it, and we need to do that. We need things like a biological control program. We need things like trees and Fraxi Protect, and if you want to develop those tools, it sort of takes time, right? And you have to put all these things together. You have to do the research to get it done, to be able to develop those tools. And on top of that, we know that there are other potential agrilids that are a risk to North America. There's one that in China that folks are worried about now that attacks poplar, and certainly if it got into Canada, that's a huge problem. I mean, poplar's a much more widespread than ash, and so what we learned about ash borer informs how we'd respond to these future invasives. So we learn a lot of stuff about EAB that informs what we're going to do on the next invasion. So it's all good information. It's all things we need to know. So I hope I answered your question.
Okay, the last one actually was more just a thank you from Keyshawn. Great presentation, Chris.
Thanks, Keyshawn.
Okay, so I think we'll let Chris off the hook. I think we've peppered him with enough questions. But thank you, Chris. You once again did a great presentation and responded to all those questions.